What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I wanted to bring to you a discussion about Maxx because after the conclusion of the 2017 North American WCQ, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the fate of Maxx and what should happen to it moving into later formats. A lot of people argue that Maxx should be banned outright entirely, and a lot of people say it should be unlimited back at 3 like it is in the OCG, and I find, these juxtaposing points very interesting. And I think it would be really good if we explore pretty much both arguments and where both sides are coming from. So to start off with, I want to present you guys with a scenario with Maxx and kind of what ends up happening. So let's assume you're going first, very similar to what happened in the NAWCQ. You start going and doing your normal plays, and then you get hit by Maxx. Well, in that instance, you essentially have 3 different lines of play you can take. The first instance is you can stop your play outright entirely and basically make your opponent -1 for using the Maxx because they didn't chain it to something, that would get them any extra cards out of it. So they take a minus, and you're at the position that you were before they used the Maxx, pretty much using Maxx as a deterrent to stop you from going into any further plays. The second option you have is to conclude your plays and get on your ending board with as minimal resources as possible. We see this happen a lot with Zodiac, where if the Zodiac player gets hit by Maxx, rather than going through cards like Chakanine and Tiger Mortar and things like that, they usually bypass that and go directly to the Trident so that they have something to pretty much threaten their opponent's board, even at the cost of giving their opponent 1 or 2 cards in the process. And then the third option is to pretty much go balls out and take the Maxx challenge, give your opponent 10, 15, 20 cards, but you're going to end on the strongest possible board that you can create, and hopefully that's going to be enough to pull you into the later terms of the game. But the biggest problem in all 3 of those scenarios is that no matter which one you pick, 80 to 90% of the time, you're pretty much fucked. And I'm gonna go ahead and explain why. So in the first scenario, you didn't do anything to prevent, to pretty much establish a board, and you let your opponent take the minus. Well, the problem is, your opponent draws a card on their next turn going up to 5 cards, and if you didn't have anything in your opening hand that's a defensive option to really stop your opponent's plays, then you're basically just fucked, because more likely than not, they're going to have enough cards already to pretty much deal with whatever lackluster board you created in the first place, and they're going to be able to completely overrun you, and just overrun you entirely, and they're going to be in the advantageous position, and you're going to be falling behind and having to play catch-up. In the second scenario, you create an inoptimal board because although you end on something that's still significant for your opponent to deal with, not only is it inoptimal for you because you didn't get the maximum amount of advantage off of that, but your opponent is getting cards from your inoptimal board already, so if they already didn't have the out to whatever the board is that you're creating, they're going to most likely draw into it off of the Maxx, and then they draw their card for turn anyway. So even if they went just +1 off the Maxx, they got to cycle the Maxx, they got an additional card, and then they get their card for turn in addition to that. So basically, it's just, again, another lose-lose scenario. And then the third and final scenario where you just take the Maxx challenge, unless you can manage to fucking deck your opponent out or create a lock that is so insurmountable that your opponent pretty much, no matter what they draw, it doesn't fucking matter, you're basically just completely fucked in this case, because they're most likely going to have like the twin twisters for your back row, they're going to have like the board wipes for whatever board you created. If you have an out for the board wipe, they're going to have a second board wipe. They're going to have the starter cards that they need to start their combos. They're going to have the cards to prevent your defensive cards from disrupting their plays. It's just going to be a fucking mess, and it's going to just be ultimately an inoptimal situation. And I think that's the biggest thing here. No matter which of those 3 options you choose from, you're just totally fucked. So, and the reason for this is because card advantage is pretty much more important in Yu-Gi-Oh! Than it is in any other card game. That's why we have cards like Pot of Greed banned. That's why we have cards like Graceful Charity banned. These cards that generate card advantage are pretty much just big targets because there's so many powerful cards, and one card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can do so much for the game compared to other games because of the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Is designed, that giving your opponent even just something as simple as a +1 can turn the tables entirely and put you at a disadvantage, and this is where Maxx C is so powerful. Now, alongside that, Maxx C being a hand trap has a lot of very unique characteristics for a hand trap that, even though it is in that category, it does things that other hand traps aren't capable of doing. For example, Maxx C and all hand traps are theoretically a -1. You know, if you use something like Effect Veiler, or let's say Duelist Lockbird, or Ghost Ogre, you're losing a card, but at the same time, in most cases, your opponent is also losing a card as well. So most of the time it breaks even, or you're preventing your opponent from just going and just generating an insane amount of card advantage, like in the case of Effect Veiler or Duelist Lockbird. Maxx C is different though. Maxx C allows you to bypass that rule, and it generates you more cards, contrary to, you know, what other hand traps do, and that's very significant. Another interesting thing about Maxx C as well is that it has probably the easiest activation requirement of any hand trap in the entire game. You know, you look at Ghost Ogre. Ghost Ogre requires a card to be activated in order to trigger. Effect Veiler, there needs to be a monster essentially on the field that's using an effect. And then cards like Duelist Lockbird, while they have a little bit wider reach, they still need a card to be triggered in order for the Duelist Lockbird to be activated and for that to go through. Maxx C can be used at any point in time at any instance, and as long as, you know, just via game mechanics you're allowed to activate a card, Maxx C can be used. Whether you're going to take a minus from it and you want to use it preemptively, let's say against a Blue Eyes player before they summon Blue Eyes Alternative Dragon, or if you chain it in response to a card that's special summoned so that you're guaranteed a free card in return, you can use it at any time, and I think that's so good for a hand trap, especially because it just adds to the flexibility that this card has. And on top of that too, most hand traps don't stop an entire core mechanic of the game. Like Effect Veiler is going to stop one monster, Ghost Ogre is going to stop one card. Duelist Lockbird arguably can stop a function of a deck, but it doesn't stop that deck from doing a bunch of other things. Well, Maxx C, you know, doesn't really stop you technically from special summoning. It acts as a very heavy deterrent, and it pretty much disincentivizes you from special summoning in general. And the fact that it basically acts in this manner really makes it this very powerful and unique hand trap in all these different aspects. You could arguably say it's a floodgate in a hand trap because your opponent really can't play around it. I mean, yeah, sure, there's ways to out Maxx C, like with Solemn Strike, or with Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Psyframe Gear Gamma, just to name a few, but ultimately, there isn't a whole lot you can do to really play around Maxx C, just depending on the type of deck that you're playing in general, because 80 to 90% of decks pretty much special summon. That's just a core fundamental mechanic of the game in general. You know, you can play around cards like Effect Veiler and Ghost Ogre much easier than you can Maxx C, and sometimes you just can't do anything about it at all. Your opponent's gonna drop it on you, and you're basically just fucked. So what I wanted to go into now is kind of discussing the unlimited side of the argument and the ban side of the argument. So the people who argue that it should be unlimited, they would say that, you know, now it's no longer this sacky one-of card, you know, because now if there's 3 of it, there isn't that argument that, oh man, you know, he drew the one Maxx C, there was nothing I could do. If he has it, he has it. If there's 3 of it, it kind of changes the dynamic. It takes away the stigma that, oh, I got luck sacked because he opened the 10% in his opening hand and managed to deter me from doing my plays. But now that it's at 3, does it really solve the problem? Because now there's a 34% chance to see it in your opening hand. You could argue that now you have a much higher likelihood of seeing it as well, meaning that if you get Maxx C'd, you can Maxx C your opponent on their turn in response, pretty much kind of, you know, giving them a taste of their own medicine. But ultimately, is that really solving the problem? Another argument to be made to have the card unlimited is that if you look in the OCG currently, Maxx C is at 3, and not even all decks in the OCG are playing 3 copies of Maxx C. Some of it are playing 3, some decks are playing 2, and some decks are not even playing a single copy at all, if you can believe that. And the reason for that is because Maxx C can be very format dependent depending on how the meta shapes up. Now, yeah, there's always going to be decks that heavily special summon, but look not too far back into the past when we had Monarchs being the best deck of the format. Maxx C was a very inoptimal card, albeit it was good against some other matchups, but most of the time Maxx C was just utterly terrible, and so you saw a lot of players not really doing anything with it because it wasn't really doing anything to help their game state, especially when they went into Monarch mirror matches. Now, there's arguments to be made that there's formats where it's insane and there's formats where it's terrible, but that's kind of how a card game goes, especially one like this, where we have such a wide card pool. And there's so many different cards at our disposal, so many different decks and archetypes, that cards are going to fluctuate and move in and out of formats naturally like that. But the thing is, now let's take a look at the other side of the argument. Should Maxx C be banned? Well, if Maxx C is banned, there isn't really a check on these decks that do heavily special summon because, yeah, we still have the other hand traps like Valor and Ghost Ogre and things like that. But as we've seen in, time and time again, these cards don't really stop these decks that just go off, and just put all of their resources onto the board. Maxx C is kind of the only card that can really help deter these decks from advancing. Something like Ghost Ogre can, yeah, stop a diagram, but then they have so many other follow-up plays after that, like Barrage or even their normal summon, Heritage, and things like that. And since you can only use one Ghost Ogre per turn, Ghost Ogre isn't really doing a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, especially when your opponent's going to gain 2 or 3 cards by the time their turn's over, so you really just wasted a card. But Maxx C is kind of that ultimate deterrent and equalizer that, by keeping it into the game and not banning it, it kind of acts as a deterrent to stop, these break my board sort of mentality, where I'm going to make a massive board and you either have to clear it or I win. Now, again, if it's banned, we kind of still have that problem among us, and Japan I don't really think has that problem as badly since Maxx C is still unlimited. But also the thing is, if you ban Maxx C as well, you're very heavily favoring players who go first, because then if you go first, you can just create this absurdly powerful board, and you know that your opponent's really not going to have anything to stop you aside from maybe the one-off hand trap or anything like that. And as we know, Maxx C is arguably the most effective going first, because when you're in an established game state and you get hit by Maxx C, it's not really the end of the world, because you still might have monsters on the field that can prevent your opponent from, doing stuff on their turn. You might already have back row on your field from previous turns as well. So, arguably going first, Maxx C is when it hits the hardest. But if Maxx C is banned, then that isn't going to be an issue, and that guarantees that the plays are going to follow through. So, ultimately, I really want to hear what you guys have to think about what you think the fate of Maxx C should be in the comments down below. Do you think it should be at 3? Do you think it should be banned? Do you think it's okay at 1? I'm really curious to hear what your guys' thoughts are, because this is such a great debate, and I really just want to hear everyone's opinions on the matter. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.
1, 2, 3.